You're listening to the first episode in a series I'm calling The Left Library, where we read dangerously and challenge mainstream thinking. What if capitalism killed itself and mutated into something stranger? That's the idea behind today's featured book, Technofeudalism. What Killed Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis. It is one of the most thought-provoking books I've read in a while. We're exploring this really quite startling claim that the economic system we've lived under, capitalism, isn't just, changing or hitting a rough patch. Varoufakis argues it's fundamentally over, done, replaced by something. Well, something new, maybe stranger, maybe more worrying, which he calls technofeudalism.
Yeah, it's a huge claim. And I think before we even, try to wrap our heads around it, it's worth knowing a bit about the author, Yanis Varoufakis. He's not just some theorist locked away somewhere. I mean, he's an economist taught at universities, University of Athens, for instance. But what really sets him apart is his time in the political trenches. He was Greece's finance minister back in early 2015.
Right, during that incredibly tense period with the EU Troika negotiations. I remember that.
Exactly. So he's seen the levers of economic power and the limits of that power up close. He's written a bunch of books criticizing capitalism, and he calls himself a libertarian Marxist, which definitely makes you pause and think.
Libertarian Marxist.
Yeah.
That's a combination you don't hear every day.
Right. So he's coming at this from a perspective shaped by both deep academic thinking and very practical, high-stakes political experience.
Okay, so he's got this unique vantage point. And our mission today, really, is to unpack his main argument. How does he get to this idea that digital platforms, this cloud capital he talks about, haven't just disrupted capitalism, but actually ended it?
Right.
We want to get into why he thinks this happened, what this new techno-feudal system actually looks like day to day, who the players are, these new digital classes, and importantly, why it matters to you, to us, living our lives, scrolling, clicking, working.
Yeah, how does it affect us? And we'll try to break it down, keep it straightforward, like we're just figuring it out together.
That sounds good. Where does he even begin with such a massive idea?
Well, interestingly, not with economics charts. He starts very personally. The book is framed as this long letter to his late father. It apparently all started from a conversation they had way back in 1993 about the very early internet.
1993, wow, that's early days for the web as most people know it.
Right. And his father, who sounds like he was a really sharp observer, asked him this killer question. Will this network make capitalism impossible to overthrow? Or might it finally reveal its Achilles heel? That question kind of stuck with Varoufakis for decades.
That's a powerful starting point. A father's question about the future. And he uses these interesting analogies early on, doesn't he, from his childhood?
He does. It's quite poetic, actually. He talks about things his father taught him using simple examples like metals. Tin just melts, right? Easy. Bronze, you can shape it. It's malleable.
Okay.
But iron's different. To change iron fundamentally, you need intense heat, and then that sudden plunge into cold water, the baptism, he calls it. Only then does it transform into something completely new. Steel. Harder, different properties.
So it's not just changing state, like melting tin. It's a fundamental transformation.
Exactly. Irreversible. He uses this to set up the whole idea of a great transformation. He's suggesting capitalism didn't just, get an update or evolve smoothly. It went through something like that iron to steel process, a fundamental, irreversible change into something else.
Okay, I get the metaphor. Transformation, not just transition. Yeah, it brings in other stuff too, right?
Yeah.
Mythology.
Yeah, like Hesiod's Ages of Man, this idea that humanity's relationship with its tools, its technology, changes over vast periods, maybe not always for the better, and Prometheus stealing fire from the gods.
Fire as technology.
Right. Technology is this fire, incredibly powerful. It can warm you, light your way, let you build amazing things. But it always carries that risk, doesn't it? It can burn everything down if you're not careful. It's got that dual nature.
Like Einstein's idea about light being both a wave and a particle.
He mentions that too, exactly. Light behaves differently depending on how you look at it. So, metals, myths, physics. What's the point of all this in a book about economics?
Yeah, I was wondering that. Seems a bit roundabout.
Well, I think he's trying to prime us, to get us thinking differently. He's saying, look, these fundamental things, labor, capital, money itself, they might also have these hidden dual natures, these contradictions, and they too can undergo radical, irreversible shifts, just like iron becoming steel.
So he wants us to be open to the possibility that the very nature of our economic system could have flipped, maybe without us fully realizing it.
Precisely. He's preparing the ground for his argument that capitalism didn't just get bigger or more digital. It became something else with a different core logic, different power structures. It's about seeing the possibility of rupture, not just smooth change.
Okay, that makes sense as a framing device. So let's talk about the system he says is gone. Capitalism. How does Varoufakis define good old-fashioned capitalism before this supposed transformation?
Well, for him, traditional capitalism is fundamentally driven by the pursuit of profit. And profit comes from a very specific dynamic in the market, particularly around labor. He starts simply with commodities, basically. Anything produced specifically to be sold in a market. If you knit a sweater for yourself, not a commodity. If you knit it to sell on Etsy, it is.
Got it. Produced for exchange.
Right. Then he gets into labor, and here's that dual nature thing again. He says labor under capitalism has two sides. There's commodity labor.
Commodity labor.
Yeah, that's the part of your work that can be measured, priced, bought, and sold. Your time, your specific skills listed on a CV, the number of widgets you produce per hour, that's what the employer pays a wage for.
Okay, quantifiable stuff.
But then there's what he calls experiential labor. This is the tricky part. It's the human spark. The creativity, the intuition, the sudden insight, the genuine empathy, the unscripted moment of connection.
Like the architect's sudden great idea, or the waiter's genuine smile you mentioned.
Exactly. Or the teacher who just connects with a struggling student in a way that makes all the difference. It's valuable, often incredibly valuable, but you can't really measure it or put a price tag on it directly.
Right, you can't contract someone for 3 eureka moments per week.
Precisely. And here's Varoufakis' really core and honestly kind of controversial argument about profit.
Yeah.
He says capitalists make profit because they cannot directly buy that experiential labor. They pay the wage for the commodity labor, the hours and skills, but they end up capturing the extra value, the exchange value that gets created by that unpurchased, unquantifiable experiential labor.
All right, so profit comes from the bit they don't pay for.
That's the crux of it. He uses this analogy. Imagine buying a jacket for $1,000.
Yeah.
Pay the price. But when you get it home, you find someone secretly sewed $2,000 cash into the lining.
Okay. Unexpected bonus.
Right. The capitalist pays the $1,000 wage, the price of the jacket, the commodity labor. But the worker's unique skill, creativity, or effort, the experiential labor, the hidden cash, added way more value, which the capitalist gets when they sell the final product or service. That gap, that surplus value generated by the unbuyable bit, that's the source of profit in his view.
Wow. Okay, that definitely turns the usual explanation.
Yeah.
Profit being about efficiency or risk-taking on its head. It's about capturing value from human creativity they couldn't directly commodify.
Exactly. It's the magic they can't bottle but still benefit from. And he contrasts this with Adam Smith's view, right? Smith saw the capitalist drive for profit, fueled by competition, as ultimately good for society.
Because competition forces them to innovate, lower prices, make better stuff.
Yeah. To beat rivals, they had to invest in better machines, find efficiencies. Smith thought this relentless self-interest, channeled by the market, would lead to progress for everyone, almost unintentionally, more effectually than when he really intends to promote it, as Smith famously put it.
Okay, so that's the baseline. Capitalism driven by profit from capturing unbought experiential value, with competition, in theory, pushing innovation. But Varoufakis says this system started changing long before, say, Google existed.
Oh, absolutely, long before. The book talks about these strange metamorphoses capitalism went through in the 20th century. A really big one was the rise of the manufacturing of desire.
Manufacturing desire, like advertising.
Exactly, but maybe deeper than just ads. It was the realization that just making stuff wasn't enough. You had to make people want the stuff intensely. Think Mad Men, they weren't just selling cigarettes or cars, they were selling status, freedom, happiness, belonging, tapping into deep psychological needs.
Creating the itch, then selling the scratch.
You got it. And new media, radio, and then especially television were crucial for this. But they also brought another shift, the attention economy. This is fascinating, he quotes. At first, radio and television gave big business a headache. The program was not the commodity. It was the attention of the people watching it. By broadcasting the program for free, they could secure the audience's attention, allowing them then to sell it.
Whoa. So the TV show wasn't the product they were selling.
Not primarily, no. The real product was your attention. The networks gathered millions of eyeballs and ears watching the show, and then they sold access to those eyeballs and ears, your attention, to advertisers.
My focus became a thing they could package and sell.
Yes. The commodification of human attention. That's a huge step towards where we are now, isn't it?
Definitely feels familiar. Okay, so Manufacturing desire, selling attention. What else changed?
Another major shift, especially on the global scale, was what he calls the global minotaur. This is his metaphor for the world economy after 1971, when the U.S. went off the gold standard, ending the Bretton Woods system.
Right, Nixon shock. Currencies floated.
They did, but the U.S. dollar kept its unique position. It wasn't backed by gold, but you still needed dollars for key global trade, like oil. It had this exorbitant privilege.
Yeah.
And the U.S. started running huge trade deficits, buying tons more stuff from places like Germany, Japan, later China, than it sold back to them.
So dollars flowed out of the U.S.
Zillions and billions. But what did those countries do with all those dollars they earned? They didn't just spend them all on American goods. They sent a huge chunk back into the U.S.
Yeah.
By buying U.S. assets. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds, essentially lending money to the U.S. government. They invested heavily in Wall Street stocks and real estate. This constant flow of capital back into the U.S. from the rest of the world, financing America's consumption and deficits, that's the tribute feeding the Minotaur.
Okay, so the U.S. buys goods, sends dollars out, and then those dollars flow back as investments, propping up U.S. finance and government spending. Sounds cyclical. What's the downside Varoufakis sees?
He argues this whole system, while making the U.S. financial elite incredibly wealthy, was built on a specific foundation, suppressing wages for the American working class. He points out that average U.S. wages basically stagnated or even fell relative to productivity after the early 1970s.
Really? Stagnated for decades.
Yeah, that's a well-documented trend. He argues this was necessary to keep the Minotaur system going, keep labor costs down, keep imports cheap, keep the financial flows going. He even links it to things like aggressive anti-union policies, making it harder for workers to demand higher wages. So it wasn't a win-win. It benefited the top tier in the U.S., fueled by global surpluses, while the domestic working class saw little gain.
Okay, so capitalism was already looking pretty different, based on desire, attention, a weird global money go-round, and stagnant wages even before the big crash. Let's get to 2008. Everyone remembers the financial crisis, near meltdown. But Varoufakis says that was the moment capitalism actually died, not just got sick.
That's his claim. It wasn't the crash itself, but the response to the crash that delivered the fatal blow and triggered the transformation. Central banks, especially the U.S. Federal Reserve, panicked. To save the system, they created trillions of dollars out of thin air.
Quantitative easing, right? QE, pumping money into the banks.
Exactly. Buying up assets, flooding the financial sector with liquidity. Their goal was to rescue capitalism. But Varoufakis says, and here's a key quote, "The central bank money printing bonanza began in 2008. In their minds, they have been saving capitalism. In reality, they have been upending it by helping to finance the emergence of cloud capital."
Woo. They thought they were giving CPR, but they were actually funding the thing that would replace it, cloud capital. We need to get into that.
We definitely do. But first, think about what that money did. We saw negative interest rates in places like Europe and Japan, basically. You had to pay to keep money safe. He calls it poisoned money. And crucially, he argues this vast ocean of new money didn't flow into building new factories or funding R&D for useful products or creating lots of good, high-paying jobs in the real economy.
Where did it go then?
It poured into assets, speculative assets, stocks shot up, real estate in major cities went sky high, fine art prices exploded, super yachts, private islands, and eventually things like cryptocurrencies, NFTs, the everything rally.
Right. Asset prices went crazy, even while wages stayed flat for many.
Exactly. He calls this gilded stagnation. Massive wealth piling up at the very top, reflected in these inflated asset prices, while the underlying productive economy kind of bumps along. And this environment, overflowing with cheap money and ever-rising asset values, supercharged things like private equity deals.
Asset stripping.
Yeah. He gives this simple model. Imagine a private equity firm buys a company that runs, say, care homes, CareCom, and owns the buildings those homes are in, PropCom. Because real estate values are soaring thanks to the cheap money, PropCom looks incredibly valuable on paper. So the PE firm loads PropCom up with debt using the inflated property value as collateral. Then it makes CareCom pay massive, often unsustainable, rent to PropCom.
Sucking cash out of the operating business into the property business.
Exactly. The PE firm extracts that cash flow from the high rent and the debt financing as huge profits or dividends for itself and its investors. They pull the value out. CareCom, meanwhile, is starved of cash, can't invest, quality of care might suffer, and it's often left crippled by the debt and rent burden, maybe eventually going bankrupt. But the PE firm already got its money out.
So they're not making the business better. They're using financial engineering fueled by cheap money to extract wealth, even if it destroys the business long term.
That's the logic he describes. It's about extracting rent, enabled by inflated asset values, not generating profit through production. He also points to the incredible concentration of power in the hands of just 3 giant asset management firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street.
The big three. I've heard of them.
They manage something like over $22 trillion in assets globally. And get this statistic.
Right.
They're the largest single shareholder in nearly 90% of all companies listed on the U.S. stock market.
90%? That's staggering. The level of potential influence across the entire economy.
It's immense. So putting it all together, Varoufakis' argument about 2008 is the rescue effort, the flood of central bank money, it didn't restore healthy capitalism. It accelerated a fundamental shift. It created a world where rent income from owning assets and controlling access became more dominant, more important than traditional capitalist profit income earned from producing goods and services. This triumph of rent over profit, fueled by central bank policies, is the sign for him that capitalism as we knew it is finished.
Okay. So the old system died, not with a bang, but with a flood of poisoned money that inflated assets and prioritized rent. That leads us to technofeudalism. What is this new system? How is it fundamentally different?
Right. If capitalism ran on capital machines, factories, the produced means of production, technofeudalism, he argues, runs on something new, cloud capital. And his definition is chilling. Cloud capital is the produced means of behavior modification.
Behavior modification. That sounds creepy, like mind control.
It sounds dystopian, I know, but he means it in a very concrete technological way. Think about the actual infrastructure, the massive data centers, the algorithms, the fiber optic networks, the smart devices. Their primary purpose, their design, isn't just to connect us or entertain us. It's to observe us, learn about us, and ultimately subtly shape what we see, what we want, and what we do.
Okay, how does that work? Give me an example from my life.
Okay, think about your smartphone, or maybe a smart speaker like Alexa or Siri. Varoufakis sees these as interfaces to cloud capital. Every time you ask a question, search for something like a post, watch a video, buy something online, you're feeding data into the system. You're training the algorithm.
Right, it learns my preferences.
It learns your preferences, your habits, your moods, your network of friends, and then it uses that knowledge to curate your feed, recommend products, suggest news articles, maybe even influence who you connect with. It's not just passively responding, it's actively shaping your digital environment. He calls it a permanently active two-way street. Unlike old TV ads, this is constantly learning and adapting to you, trying to impute desires, as he puts it, predict or even create wants, and then steer you towards fulfilling them, usually within its own ecosystem.
So it's not just predicting what I might like, it's actively trying to guide my choices, to modify my behavior.
That's the core function of cloud capital, in his view. And here's the truly revolutionary part, he argues. We build this incredibly valuable cloud capital for them, for free.
How do we build it?
Every photo you upload, every review you write, every click, every scroll, every correction you make to a map app. All that is data. It's training material. It improves the algorithms, makes the platform stickier, more effective at modifying behavior, more valuable, he says. Cloud capital can reproduce itself in ways that involve no waged labor. How? By commanding almost the whole of humanity to chip into its reproduction for free. Billions of us, spending hours every day generating data that makes these platforms richer and more powerful without getting paid a cent for that specific labor.
So my time spent scrolling and clicking is actually unpaid labor building someone else's empire. That kind of reframes my social media habits.
It does, doesn't it? And this dynamic defines the new class structure he outlines. Most of us, the users interacting with these platforms, are the cloud serfs.
Cloud serfs, like medieval serfs tied to the land.
Kind of. He argues we're tied to these digital platforms. Our data, our online identity, isn't truly ours. It's controlled by the platform owner. We have to agree to their terms, give up privacy, constantly feed them data just to participate in basic online life, even as he puts it, buying socks for granny, using a debit card. It's all mediated, all generating data. This is the new enclosures. The open digital commons of the early internet has been carved up into these private walled gardens.
Fenced off, and we pay rent with our data and attention. Okay, who else is there besides serfs?
Then you have the cloud proles. These are workers in more traditional jobs, but their work is increasingly managed and monitored by algorithms linked to cloud capital. The classic example is the Amazon warehouse worker, tracked constantly by scanners, tasks dictated by software, performance minutely analyzed.
Like Chaplin in modern times, but with an algorithm cracking the whip.
Pretty much, and he uses a stark statistic to illustrate the shift in value capture. He says old industrial companies like GE might have spent around 80% of their revenue on wages. Tech giants like Facebook, maybe closer to 1%.
1% versus 80. Where does the rest go?
A huge chunk becomes profit for the platform owners, often routed through tax havens. It shows how little of the value generated in this new system flows back to traditional labor compared to the old one. Then there are the platforms themselves, the digital territories, Amazon.com, the App Store, Google Search. He calls these cloud fiefs.
Fiefs, like a feudal lord's domain.
Exactly. He says quite provocatively, enter Amazon.com and you have exited capitalism. His point is, these are not open competitive markets. The owner of the platform, Amazon, Apple, Google, sets all the rules. They decide who can sell, what they can sell, how visible they are, and crucially, what cut they take. It's their private kingdom.
So businesses operating on Amazon aren't just in a market, they're tenants in Bezos' digital realm.
That leads to the next group, the vassal capitalists. These are the traditional businesses, the manufacturers selling goods on Amazon, the restaurants listed on delivery apps, the app developers in the App Store, maybe even Uber drivers using the platform. They rely on these cloud faiths to reach customers, but they're dependent on the platform owner, the cloudalist.
And they have to pay for that access.
Yes. And that payment isn't profit being shared, it's cloud rent. This is the key concept. Cloud rent is the tribute extracted by the cloudalists, the owners of the fiefs and cloud capital, from everyone operating within their domain, from the cloud serfs via data attention, and from the vassal capitalists via fees, commissions, advertising costs.
So the cut Uber takes from drivers, the fees Amazon charges sellers, the 30% Apple takes from app sales, that's all cloud rent.
That's exactly how he defines it. It's rent paid for access to the privately controlled digital space and its behavior-modifying tools. It's income from owning the digital infrastructure and controlling access, not from producing something in the traditional capitalist sense. This dominance of cloud rent over traditional profit is the defining feature of technofeudalism for Varoufakis. And when someone like Elon Musk talks about turning Twitter X into an everything app, that's a clear bid to build a massive cloud fief to maximize cloud rent extraction.
Okay, so the whole system is geared towards controlling digital territory and extracting rent from every interaction within it. It's a huge shift from making things and selling them for profit.
A fundamental shift, he argues. And it doesn't just change our online shopping, it changes global politics, too.
How does this technofeudal setup affect things between countries? You mentioned a new Cold War.
Yeah, he argues this new system is driving a new Cold War, primarily between the US and China. But unlike the old Cold War, it's not really about ideology, communism versus capitalism. He sees it as driven by the naked techno-feudal class interests of the dominant cloudalist powers in each bloc. It's a struggle for global dominance over cloud capital and, crucially, cloud finance. The world is splitting into two competing super cloud fiefs.
A Cold War fought with algorithms and digital payment systems instead of missiles.
Sort of, yeah. He points to the U.S. decision to freeze Russia's central bank dollar reserves after the Ukraine invasion as a key moment. That was huge. Historically, even in wartime, assets like that were often considered untouchable.
Because it undermines trust in the whole system if reserves can just be seized.
Exactly. Varoufakis argues that move sent a shockwave, especially to countries like China holding trillions in U.S. dollar assets. It made them realize how vulnerable they were to U.S. control over the existing global financial plumbing.
And that pushes them to build their own plumbing.
Precisely. Look at China's push for the digital yuan. It's issued directly by their central bank, potentially allowing international transactions to bypass the traditional banking system, SWIFT, and other networks heavily influenced by the U.S. He calls this possibility Washington's worst nightmare, a direct challenge to the dollar's dominance, enabled by cloud finance technology.
So competing digital financial systems is a core part of this rivalry.
Yes. And he touches on how this division makes tackling global problems like climate change even harder. Instead of one global effort, you risk getting two separate, competing green transitions, maybe played off against each other by vested interests like fossil fuel companies who can benefit from the rivalry.
So the very structure of this techno-feudal world makes global cooperation on existential threats more difficult.
That's the implication. Competition between the super cloud fiefs takes precedence, driven by the imperative to accumulate cloud rent and consolidate power within their respective blocks.
Well, it's a pretty bleak picture overall. Does Varoufakis offer any way out, any hope, or is it just diagnosis?
The book is mostly diagnosis, really digging into how we got here and what the system looks like. But he does touch on potential paths forward, ideas he explores more in other work. He talks about radical shifts needed, like truly democratized companies.
Oh, would that work?
Imagine companies where it's one employee, one vote, and maybe shared ownership. So workers aren't just selling their labor, they have real decision-making power and a stake in the enterprise. It fundamentally changes that power dynamic.
Moving beyond just wages.
Right.
Yeah.
And crucially, he talks about reclaiming the commons, treating essential resources, land, but also now the cloud, this digital infrastructure we all rely on and contribute to, not as private property to be enclosed and rented out by cloudalists, but as a shared resource managed collectively for everyone's benefit.
Treating the internet infrastructure like a public utility almost.
Something like that. He ends on a cautiously optimistic note, suggesting the very tools that built technofeudalism could be repurposed. He says, "The bad news is that the internet bred a form of capital which killed capitalism but replaced it with something far worse. The good news is that we now have at our disposal tools with which we might reestablish a new commons." The big question, the challenge he leaves us with, is how do we actually do that? How do we build that democratic control against such concentrated power?
So the technology isn't the enemy, it's the ownership and control structure. And maybe the tech itself holds the seeds for a different future.
That seems to be the glimmer of hope he offers. It shifts the focus from just lamenting the present to actively thinking about building alternatives.
Well, this has been incredibly thought-provoking.
Yeah.
We've gone through Varoufakis' argument that capitalism is dead, replaced by technofeudalism, driven by cloud capital and rent extraction. We've looked at the new players, cloud serfs, cloud proles, vassal capitalists, cloudalists, the nature of cloud fiefs, and the reshaping of global power into this new Cold War.
It definitely forces you to look at your phone, your apps, your online interactions in a completely different way, doesn't it? Are you just browsing? Or are you working for free? Are you a customer or a serf in a digital fiefdom?
It absolutely challenges so many assumptions about the economy, about technology, about our own lives. The ideas are big, sometimes dense, but he really does try to make them graspable with these analogies and real-world examples. If this conversation has piqued your interest or maybe made you slightly uncomfortable about your digital life, checking out the book itself, Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism, is definitely worthwhile.
Varoufakis' arguments are bold and insightful, though some might say controversial. What do you think? Has capitalism really died? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this.